Cats Don't Dance is a 1997 Warner Brothers animated film that is another case of an animated film that got the shaft back then, due to the fact that the movie was a box office bomb, and around the time of the movie's release, it became a casualty of the merger between Turner and Time Warner, as well as the fact that the movie barely had any sort of advertising and was poorly marketed. Not to mention, around the time of its release, it got majorly overshadowed by the film that Warner released months prior, Space Jam, which used a bigger IP, which is honestly kind of a shame, because as opposed to most of the other films that Warner would end up putting out later on, this film has its own identity that not enough people really gave this movie credit for. What is this movie about? This film revolves around a cat named Danny. He wants to be a movie star that, at the same time, is also a singer. So he goes to Hollywood in hopes of starting an acting career there. After meeting a young penguin named Pudge, Danny is selected by agent Farley Wink to feature in a film that is in production at Mammoth Pictures called Lil Archangel, alongside Wink's secretary, a cynical Turkish Angara named Sawyer. But due to a popular, yet spoiled child actress named Darla Dimple, Danny needs to find a way to get the other animals into the spotlight in order to show that animals can be just as talented at acting as much as humans are. To start off this review, I'm going to state right now that for an animated film that came out in the 1990s, that is not Disney related, it's honestly kind of refreshing to see that while this film does have the usual requirements that every non-Disney animated film from the 90s had, this film tries to at least do its own thing, rather than trying to be like Disney. It's still a musical, yes, but it's trying to be a Warner Brothers movie, not a Disney movie. You see, back in the 1990s, animated films and TV shows more often than not tried to be one of two things. They were either trying to follow the gross-out slapstick trend left behind by Ren and Stimpy with varying results, or in the case of animated films, they were trying to emulate the success of Disney by being Broadway musicals. But one similar thing that a lot of these films had with each other is that they were really not good. Some of them do admittedly have that so bad it's good charm, like the 1992 Tom and Jerry movie, but the rest of them can range from being subpar to downright offensive and insulting, like The Magic Voyage or the Miramax cut of The Thief and the Cobbler. But one similar problem that a lot of these other films have that make them all fail in the exact same way is that they fail to have their own identity, because all of them were way too focused on trying too hard to be Disney, so they ended up not feeling like a movie owned by the company that they were owned by. Take the 1992 Tom and Jerry movie, for example. Tom and Jerry is a franchise that has revolved entirely around slapstick, but yet the 1992 movie decided to go the direction of being a musical, as well as ripping off The Rescuers. Same thing applies to Quest for Camelot, where it feels less like a Warner Brothers movie, but it feels more like a Disney movie instead. So, what does this have to do with my discussion of Cats Don't Dance? Well, that's where the discussion comes in. What separates Cats Don't Dance from a lot of these other Disney clones, this movie, despite also contributing as a musical, is less concerned with trying to be like Disney, because it also realizes that it's a Warner Brothers movie, and what is Warner Brothers well known for? The Looney Tunes. So it completely fits with what the movie is trying to go for. The film is very self-aware of what it wants to do, and that the film is very meta a lot of the time. We get a lot of inside jokes when it comes to other movies, including King Kong, and even at the end of the movie, where we see a lot of film posters for what the animals basically star in, after they prove that animals could also prove themselves that they could sing and act. They basically spoof things like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and The Mask, which does also make sense for this movie to do, because around the time of this movie's release, Animaniacs was at the height of its popularity, and Animaniacs was also known to do a satire of other products, even of Space Jam and Quest for Camelot, ironically. Now, some people could look at this movie and say that the film doesn't really make sense for what it's trying to push, because as early as the 1920s, cartoon animal characters were allowed to star in movies or TV shows. But in all honesty, I really don't mind this at all in the movie. The film is not trying to be accurate to the real world. You really think that a movie about talking animals, living in the same society as humans, is going to care about real-world events? I mean, if it's based on a true story like the Titanic movies, The Magic Voyage, and The Star, that's when it becomes a problem. And besides, without the context of the characters being animals and instead being humans, it would be super obvious that this movie is trying to be an allegory for racism. But the fact that the characters are animals makes this movie feel very subtle and clever. I'd even say that the movie definitely feels like a proto-Zootopia with how it handles its subject matter. With the fact that the animals have nothing to do in the films they star in than just being animal noises, and how the villain, Darla Dimple, constantly treats animals as if they can't do anything else except act like animals. Which I gotta say, is a very bold move on this movie's end. And speaking of Darla Dimple, she's definitely the highlight of the film. She reminds me of Angelica Pickles from Rugrats, except she's a lot more over the top and is honestly a bigger jerk than Angelica. But what makes Darla Dimple in this movie much better than Angelica is that the movie actually takes advantage of the jerkiness, because with Angelica Pickles, they've had her be a nuisance to the babies, but the show kind of resets her by the end of each episode, and you could argue that the only reason as to why Angelica is the way she is because her father just lets her get off the hook way too much, and he hardly even does anything to really fix her behavioral issues. With Darla Dimple, on the other hand, she is a full-blown villain, whom, despite having everything she wants because she's perceived as cute by everyone around her, she's still willing to use it as an opportunity to be villainous. And she also has this manipulative side to her, where she's pretending to be all kind and cutesy, but is actually a devil on the inside. And I just love the absurdness that this little girl is more of a threat to the main characters than this giant emotionless bodyguard that she has named Max, who is a literal giant. Both of these characters offer some of the funniest bits in the film, and their scenes are the most memorable, as opposed to a lot of the other aspects of the film, which does end up leading me to say that Cats Don't Dance is not a perfect film. It actually has quite a lot of issues, in fact, which does hold me back from saying that this movie was close to being great, because, well, if you're wondering why I'm currently struggling to talk about a lot of the other aspects of the film, it's because I don't have too much to say. To start things off, I didn't really get invested with the characters all that much. Not just because of the fact that the characters that do have a character arc in this movie, namely Sawyer, end up getting shoved to the side because of the pacing issues, which I will get to, but also, the movie chooses most of its runtime to have the main character, Danny, try and pull strings in order to get the animals more involved with movies again. But most of the film has this sort of Hey Arnold effect, where the other characters around the protagonist are much more interesting than the main protagonist himself. But unlike Hey Arnold, where the main character was just the everyman, but everyone around him were able to make up for Arnold, Cats Don't Dance has the concept for a very interesting side cast, but they barely put any focus on them. So, as a result, we're basically stuck with Danny for most of the film, and I can basically describe him as the cookie-cutter protagonist that has their entire personality based on the one thing that they want to do. In this case, Danny wants to be a singer in a motion picture, and that's about it. And unlike Bodhi from Rock Dog or Felicie from Leap, we don't see how Danny is like because of how frantically paced this movie is. Oh, but Danny is kind-hearted. Isn't that a character trait? Well, yeah. That is an emotion, but a surface-level emotion at most. At this point, I've seen several characters in TV shows or movies that had the character trait of the kind-hearted protagonist, and even they were able to display their other traits besides happiness. Even Joy from Inside Out has more character traits than Danny, and Joy was literally just an emotion inside of Riley's head. Also, the pacing in this movie is really not good. It's not that the film rushes through the beginning portions, while the rest of the film feels like it's much longer than it is, like Little Nemo Adventures in Slumberland or The Boss Baby, or that a majority of the film is getting to a location, so the rest of the film feels like it's rushed, like Escape from Planet Earth, or that the entirety of the film is bloated with songs like Raggedy Ann and Andy A Musical Adventure. This entire movie is rushed, including the end credits, The total runtime of this movie is an hour and 15 minutes. Only 74 minutes that this movie has to get through the entirety of its plot. And so, because of this, the characters are very underdeveloped, and the story also feels half-baked. So much so that the beginning of the film feels like it's trying as hard as possible to get itself over with, leading to the film hardly taking any sort of breaks whatsoever. That it ended up being way too much to process all at once, with the film having the characters not taking a moment to breathe in any way whatsoever. Yep. Just like what I stated back during my review on Storks, this movie honestly starts off on a very rough note. The first 19 or 20 minutes of the film is at breakneck speed in order to get the plot rolling. And unlike Mighty Magiswords, this is an animated film that can take as much time as it needs to. But yet, the film feels like it's in such a hurry to get the beginning sequences out of its system, so it doesn't have to worry about losing the kids' attention. Honestly, it kind of reminded me of Home on the Range. You know, the movie where the farm is being closed down! That's not a good thing, because that film has this issue and more. Not to mention being absolutely stupid. Cats Don't Dance is still better than Home on the Range, because the film does end up getting better after the sequence where Danny ends up messing things up for the film that they were shooting, but the pacing issues are still present, even without taking the beginning of the film into consideration, as the film is still extremely rushed, which is honestly kind of a shame, because the characters in this movie do have what could be considered interesting, but the film feels so fast that they are left with absolutely nothing. Like this elephant character who wants to do more than just the logo for each film, or this goat and fish couple who want to do the tango. Not even Storks has this issue, as even that film was able to flesh out its characters, even those that aren't really the main focus of that movie, especially since the film has an hour and 27 minutes to its runtime. Now, some people could argue that this movie was released in the 90s, and films around that time were not intended to be Spider-Verse levels of length in regards to how long they were, but even around the time of this movie's release, while there were definitely animated films that did have this amount of length in their runtime, other films were able to be given longer runtimes, such as Aladdin or The Lion King, which were both standard in regards to their length, being an hour and a half. But this is the kind of film where this kind of runtime is absolutely needed, because none of the characters are fleshed out enough to really be given all that much development. And for a movie that is filled to the brim with as many characters as it could possibly have, that's honestly a problem. Also, as standard for animated movies, especially one where the villain hides his plans from the others, this film also offers an Act 2 breakup, where Darla Dimple thanks Danny for basically helping her with the plan, before the other characters basically give him the cold shoulder, before he decides to go back to his hometown with the other characters moping and doping, before the main character, of course, comes back to help the others before defeating the main antagonists. I really don't like this Act 2 breakup, not only because of the fact that, with the naive state of mind, of course Danny was going to be emotionally manipulated, but this Act 2 breakup is incredibly pointless, because you could have taken this out of the movie, and literally nothing would have changed. And unlike the Act 2 breakup from Storks, the animals act as if Danny betrayed them or something? Movie, you do realize that because of the fact that Danny is an incredibly kind-hearted character who is not aware about the fact that manipulation is a thing, that he was going to get manipulated by Darla into believing her, right? And on top of this Act 2 breakup not working on any fundamental level, it's also very contrived as well. During the sequence where all the animals were getting into the prop boat, Danny outright says that he was able to get all of them a new role in the film they were shooting. So through this, they should have been able to gather that Danny talked to Darla, and a lot like the Act 2 breakup in A Bug's Life, this is yet another case where there was an easy way of being able to solve the issue, and they made it completely difficult instead. But whereas with that film, the Act 2 breakup was gonna happen regardless, this movie didn't even need to throw this in, because Danny didn't do anything wrong in the slightest. I also had to question why nobody questioned the culprit of who actually flooded the stage. Yeah, I get that it needed to be here for the plot to happen, but the animals were not even the ones who flooded the stage. They couldn't have been able to do this because of the fact that they were inside the boat while the stage was getting flooded. And as soon as we hear that dialogue of most of them not being able to work in movies ever again, we immediately cut to them being thrown out of the studio, not even showing them attempting to defend themselves or anything like that. That's honestly kind of a questionable aspect of the movie, if I'm being honest. So overall, Cats Don't Dance is a good film. However, I'd struggle to really say that it's a masterpiece. It's definitely not as good as Storks because of the fact that this movie starts off rough, but then as soon as it steps up its game, it becomes extremely rushed, with problems sprinkled throughout the runtime. But it's definitely able to get above the area of my ranking of films that are just decent but nothing special, because Cats Don't Dance has the foundation be better than it is now, but ends up being a bit of a letdown with its pacing issues, as well as not giving enough time to really develop the characters. But hey, as the old saying goes, sometimes you get things better on the second try rather than the first, given that the director, Mark Dindal, went on to direct The Emperor's New Groove, which I may end up getting to another time, but for Cats Don't Dance, I'd say that this film would sit comfortable in the 7 out of 10 category, but that's the most that I could really say about it.